Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome everyone to our final day of the Pharmacy History Festival. My name is Erika Dyck, and I'm very excited and honored to be part of this penultimate panel, and with our guest author, David Guba. David received his PhD in European history from Temple University in 2018, and his research explores the colonial history of cannabis in modern France. And so we're really excited today to be talking about his book, which I happily just received in the mail a few weeks ago. I know you can't appreciate how beautiful the cover is, but I think he has slides that will show you the cover in a moment. And I want to make sure that there's lots of time for David to speak, but I do want to say just a couple of things about the book. Not only is the cover beautiful, it is the first book in the new series on intoxicating history. So I encourage you all with your book manuscripts to reach out and contact me or Virginia Barrage about your potential manuscripts. But we're really excited to be showcasing this book here at the conference and as part of the series. David Guba's book is a timely intervention in some of the conversations about the decriminalization and potential medicalization of cannabis. And I just want to read you one blurb from the back that I think helpfully summarizes it from our co-participant, Jim Mills, who says, Taming Cannabis, that's the title of the book, Taming Cannabis is a landmark publication tackling the history of cannabis in France for the first time. Thoroughly researched and as readable as it is significant, Guba carefully demonstrates that the first French encounters with cannabis products during the period ensured that ideas about the substances were little more than Orientalist myths created by colonial fantasists. His conclusion that these myths still shape racist ideas about cannabis products and their consumers in policy and police circles to this day. It is compelling and it is controversial. So I'm very excited to turn the mic over to David Guba, who's going to tell us about that compelling and controversial history of 19th century French cannabis policing. Thank you.
All right, let me share without closing the meeting like I did earlier. Okay, so you should be able to see my presentation. View and present. All right, thank you very much. If at any point I go dark, please let me know or just speak up. Thank you very, very much to the AIHP and to the School of Pharmacy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you as well to Lucas, to Kristen, to Greg, and anyone else working behind the scenes to really make this festival great. It's been a true pleasure to learn from all of you and to listen to these great talks. I'd also like to thank McGill-Queen's University Press just quickly. They have an amazing group of editors, an amazing group of reviewers and referees who made themselves known to me, Jim Mills, Todd Shepard at Johns Hopkins. Without their guidance and advice throughout the process of revising the manuscript, it would not be as strong of a book or anywhere near what it is without them. Thank you as well to the editors of the series that Erika just introduced, Virginia Barrage and Noel Plack as well. Just to have your names associated in any way with what I'm doing is a really strong badge of honor for me, because I didn't get into drugs history really until about 3 or 4 years ago at the tail end of my doctoral program, and I've really found a great home in the ADHS and the AIHP, and very, very much thank you for that. Today, what I want to talk about is why I wrote the book and how it contributes to French history and to the history of drugs and medicine. I also want to briefly offer some synopses of some chapters, but really what I want to focus in on my fourth and a little bit of my fifth chapter, which explore the rise and fall of hashish as medicine in 19th century France, as this is a conference on the history of pharmacy, and then we'll have a Q&A. So let's get into it. Why I wrote this book. There are some presentists or present concerns that cannot go without being stated if we're going to talk about cannabis in France. The first is France today has the highest rate of cannabis use, particularly among the youth of all EU member states, and as you can see is fifth, and this is somewhat dated statistics, but they are among the world's largest consumers of cannabis products. At the same time, France has the harshest laws, arguably, in Europe against cannabis, a prohibition regime that's been in place since 1970 for recreational marijuana and been in place since 1953 for medical cannabis. At the same time, there is, and this is really what got me interested in this project to begin with, there is an incredibly strong epistemic link in French popular culture, in French medicine, and French law that goes back centuries, which links Muslim and Arab people and cultures to cannabis and violence as this sort of triangular relationship of anti-state violence produced via hashish consumption. And if even a cursory Google search of these ideas and related to French history and French culture produces a lot of data points right off the bat. On the top left, you see an ancient, somewhat ancient picture of the famous assassins of Alamut, which were popularized by Marco Polo and then attached or affixed to the idea of hashish via Sylvestre de Sacy, which I'll talk about in a second. On the bottom left, this is actually a print from a 2018 children's book that looks at the Sinbad, the mariner Sinbad and his ventures, which were, of course, detailed in Antoine Galland's famous 1001 Nights, the translations, which have a vibrant and controversial history themselves. And in this, you see the story of the fourth voyage in which Sinbad escapes a group of, at least in the original telling, are Black Africans, the Noirs, as it's said. But these group of primitives, as they're called in the story, use a particular herb to dull the consciousness and rationality of their captors, and eventually Sinbad's fellows end up eaten by these cannibals, and he gets to escape because he realizes that there's this problem with this herb. As you move forward away from popular culture and you look at law, there is a significant amount of rhetoric about the assassins and hashish in the debates about cannabis leading up into the 1970 prohibition. And then even today, and things like Assassin's Creed, which interestingly enough featured an edition called Unity, in which it was set during the French Revolution, which is absolutely fascinating for me. And at the same time, the 2015 attacks, which I was in Paris living during these events, they were immediately tied in the press to the ideas of the hashishans and the assassins. And there were even very notable psychiatrists in the main media, primary media, Le Monde, etc., talking about these modern day hashishans. So clearly, there is some kind of link that we need to address. The other side of this, and if you're familiar with my work, this is what's the controversial side. There seems to be a correlation between these ideas and the ways in which the French go about policing, regulating, and incarcerating people for drug crimes. I've written about this, not extensively, but in several places, including The Conversation and Slow. And more or less my argument, and it's impossible to verify statistically because since the 1970s, it's been illegal to chart, or at least institutionally chart, statistics related to race in France. But this strong epistemic link is very much present. If you remember, if you're knowledgeable of French popular culture, several years ago, Eric Zemmour said the comment that all drug dealers are Black and Arab, and this was an expression of this kind of epistemic link that still drives not only thinking about cannabis in France today, but the way in which it's regulated and prohibited, even in these recent moments where there's been movement towards ultimately legalization. So in recent years, there has been movement. The ANSM, which is the FDA, more or less, of the French government and French state, they have decided starting January 2021 that they're going to open a medical trial for 3,000 patients, which is the first time since 1953 that something like this has been legal and state-sponsored. There is some worry that because they haven't published this yet, which is important for enacting law in France and elsewhere, that it's not going to happen, but so far it seems like it's going to be happening. And the other thing that's happened recently, which I'm in the process of writing about, is the French have switched to a national 200 euro spot fine for cannabis consumption. I argue that this is really just moving in the direction of trying to simplify the prohibition and make it easier for the police to ultimately collect their fine, and it does nothing at all to erase the prohibitionist legacy or the logic behind it. So, my book, which the first couple pages are here, the table of contents, and then the intoxicating histories. My book, which is largely based on my dissertation at Temple University, it starts the process of exploring the colonial history of cannabis in modern France, which is largely responsible for the conundrums and hypocrisies and inequities currently plaguing French cannabis and drug policy. And over the course of this research, I found and discovered, which is, I think, why I'm here, a vibrant early career cycle, to use a term from an article that I read earlier, Stefan Snelders and Antoine Peters, two excellent historians. But there is this early career cycle in cannabis that is largely left out of the historiography, or merely footnoted, or largely mythologized because of some more scandalous or sensational elements attached to this history, such as the Club de Hashish, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on, that wasn't too bad, I'm going to focus on content within the book dealing with the history of pharmacy. I'm quickly going to summarize the main arguments in the first 3 chapters, if you'll spare the time with me. And then I'm going to spend the remaining time focused on the 4th chapter, A Drug Not to Be Neglected, Medicalizing Hashish in France, which really focuses on, as I say, in the 1810 to 1850, is really the heyday of hashish in terms of French history and the medicalization of it, the first instance of it. So in the first chapter, I look at the early history, or the prehistory of cannabis in France, particularly leading up to the taxonomic classification of cannabis indica and cannabis sativa. This occurs, as many of you I'm sure are familiar, in the 1780s and 1750s for cannabis sativa with Linnaeus, and 1780s with cannabis indica for Lamarck. And we all know the differences, and probably have even read the pharmacopoeia entries about these distinctions in both botany, physical look, and also what they produce in terms of products. I found in my research that well before the arrival of this taxonomic bifurcation, of this split, the French particularly were already constructing a sociocultural understanding of these two plants, what they called chanvre ordinaire, or chanvre cultivée, cannabis indica, and then what they called chanvre indienne, even before cannabis indica is formally codified by Lamarck. And what I show is cannabis sativa has a very long, vibrant history in France, going all the way back through the Bourbon era into the time of Charlemagne. And there is this association between cannabis sativa and hemp and naval power, which ultimately winds up producing a monopoly led by Jean-Baptiste Colbert early in the late 1600s, mid to late 1600s, and then he dies, and the East India Company of France takes over this trade. But there's a strong, even to this day, connection between hemp, cannabis sativa, and French power, or French national security, or even French patrimoine, this idea of heritage and national pride. On the other side of this, chanvre indienne had the almost exact connotations attached to Orientalist fantasies, and I chart these fantasies as they developed in French discourse from things like Marco Polo's travelogue in the 1300s through Antoine Galland's translation of the 1001 Nights, which wasn't so much a translation as a fabrication in certain instances, and then through several other scientific discourse dictionaries, for instance, botanical encyclopedias, pharmacopoeia, that consistently chart this path for cannabis indica versus cannabis sativa. In chapter 2, I look at what happens when the French finally encounter for the first time en masse this cannabis indica that they had written so much about and had so thoroughly and firmly placed into this category of barbarism, incivility, and otherness. And what happens, and this is probably what got me on the subject in the first place, is there is a significant amount of talk in the discourse and historiography about Napoleon passing a cannabis prohibition in 1800 while occupying Egypt during the French Revolutionary Wars. And indeed, Napoleon did lead an army to Egypt in 1798 and stayed there for a while, but he realized in 1799 that it was not going his way, that he was not going to get an advantage or leg up on the British, which ultimately was his idea, use Egypt as a staging ground to ultimately attack British control in India. And he goes back to France and he rises in power to become Napoleon, the emperor, eventually. Several years need to pass. What happens is command shifts to a man named Jacques-Francois Manu. Manu is an incredibly interesting figure that's been largely lost to history, largely because Napoleon did not like him. Other military generals did not like him. And he did have a couple key defeats that made people in history really connect him to military defeat, which is not a good thing if you're trying to be well known or remembered. But the one reason Manu is not well known and remembered is because of his colonial policies. He converted to Islam, and sincerely so. He remained a practicing Muslim until his death in 1812, I believe. So he remained a devout, I suppose, and it's hard to gauge one's devotion because in letters to soldiers, French friends, he's very, I'm doing this for political expediency, but to the French, especially Egyptian citizens of the new sister republic, he's very much telling them that they're part of this society, and so is Islamic practices. So what happens is Manu consistently moves in the direction of the elite group of Sunnis who control Egypt at this time. He marries into one of these families. He actually brings his wife and child back to France with him after the expedition goes wrong. But the hashish ban is passed in the atmosphere of Manu's colonial policies trying to placate Sunni elites who ultimately viewed hashish use, particularly among Sufis and particularly among the working class, as a problem, as an issue, and thus Manu saw it as an issue of national security, of colonial security. So the hash ban wasn't passed by Napoleon in an attempt to civilize these barbaric people in the North African region that they were colonizing. It was in fact this attempt to blend an integrated colonial policy that yes, certainly did not look at or even legally think of indigenous populations as equals, but nonetheless rhetorically framed it as such. And this is why I use the framing of colonial mimicry to make sense of what's going on here. The third chapter, I look at what happens when the Egyptian campaign is over and the ideas about cannabis, as well as some hashish and cannabis itself, cannabis indica as they call it, are starting to come back to France and influence the ways in which people understand cannabis itself. And I think I can move in. I kept myself purposely from having slides for those chapters so I didn't geek out on anything. So let's move a little forward. Okay. So after the Egyptian campaign, a North African connection develops. And largely this connection is operated by doctors, physicians, military soldiers, even some high-level ranking soldiers. But for the most part, it's a small amount. It's not a huge trade or operation. And it's very, if not impossible, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to really understand the size of it, the scope of it. In my research, I've been able to find key individuals who were sending hashish from Egypt and from North Africa to France, and almost all of them are doctors, leading all the way up into the 1840s and 1850s. So it's very much an internal trade of people working on the plant medically. So ultimately, what happens when ideas about hashish come back, they land on a variety of different academic fields. One of them is ultimately philology, and many of you, I'm sure, some of you have even written about. I've looked at the list of people who are here, have written about Sylvestre de Sacy. I talk about this in my third chapter. I also published this originally as an article, a standalone article in SHAD, Social History of Alcohol and Drugs, back in 2016, so it's available there as well. But essentially, the philologist Sylvestre de Sacy was a very opportunistic, I think, scholar, and he heard what was going on with Egypt, and there's all this mania about Egypt that leads into the description of Egypt, this massive volume that is considered sort of it's the birth of Egyptology, but an ill birth in certain ways. But what Sacy does is he sees in this story of hashish a link with the research that he's doing, particularly on the assassins of Alamut from the 12th and 13th century, which are an important story in the story of the Crusades, which is what Sylvestre de Sacy ultimately studies. So Sacy, hearing about Egypt, hearing about this hashish ban, and also very early on confusing why the hashish ban was created. It's very clear from the way Sacy reads it that he does not care or even know about the colonial mimicry afoot with Manu that I talked about earlier, Abdallah Manu. So he very early on is almost obfuscating or revising the history of the hashish ban. And this is, and you can chart it all the way in through 1830, 1840. People who are citing Saucy, they very quickly start affixing Napoleon to the hashish ban when talking about Saucy, talking about the hashish ban. So I was very interested in charting what's called intertextually, if you look at communication studies, the ways in which facts and knowledge about cannabis were taken from multiple areas of knowledge production, set in a thesis or an argument as a premise to support a conclusion, right? His premise for Saucy was these ancient assassins of Alamut used hashish, and there's an argument and some discrepancy over how they used hashish or why, but it was ultimately reductively connected to their violent actions of murder and assassination. And therefore, he also makes the claim this is where the term assassin comes from, hashish, hashishon, assassin. So he's able to use this argument, which is almost, it's in many ways constructed from French colonial thinking, from French colonial fantasies, that then is funneled into this very important, in the time, early 1800s, philology is it. Philology is the big study. Like you're an important person in the academy if you're studying philology. I should also mention Saucy was a government official. They would go to him to ask him about policy decisions in the Orient, as they called it. So Saucy makes this etymological connection, hashish equals assassins, makes this, really solidifies for the first time, using scholarly authority, makes this link. Pharmacists really jump on this, and doctors, they jump on this. And this is a quote that comes out of the first bulletin of pharmacy produced by the Society of Pharmacy of Paris in the early years of their professional development in the 1800s. And they argue, the intoxication produced by hashish throws the user into a sort of ecstasy similar to that achieved by Orientals through the use of opium. It even happens that users fall in prey to its effects, engage in brutal actions that arise from dementia and delirium. But cannabis, and there was no break between these sentences, but cannabis deserves the attention of pharmacists and chemists. Could they not, through analysis and diverse tests, discover some essence that we can extract in some preparations that it can furnish? So right away, and they do make some explicit reference to Saucy, but as you can see in the citation, this was a review of Saucy's famous paper in which he made this etymological link. So again, you see almost an interdisciplinary development in ways that we would probably applaud, at least the logistics of them today. This interdisciplinary development from philology, taking ideas from this recent, burst of interest in Egypt and popular culture, and then funneling them through as arguments, as premises in arguments and conclusions about what cannabis is and how it should be treated. So doctors really took note of this. That article I showed you was published in 1809. Between 1810 and 1820, there's not much movement. There's a significant amount going on in French history that seemingly is taking away, especially the sources that I was looking at. Medical sources are entirely focused on military medicine towards the end of Napoleon's reign. So there's not much in the journals, in the discourse, talking about cannabis. It starts to come back in French discourse in the late 1820s and 1830s. And it's mostly focused in on the work of people like Aubert Roche, Louis-Remy Aubert Roche, who's an epidemiologist. He is one of these links, and I talk about this in my 4th chapter. He's one of these people that's working in Egypt for Muhammad Ali Pasha and running his hospitals and trying to sort of marry Western medical conceptions with what's going on down there. And he writes a lot about this. And he's also somebody that's sending back to Paris a decent amount of hashish in the form of dawames, which is an edible that's cooked with activated hashish. Nutmeg, it has ginger in it. It's very much like an edible today. So Aubert Roche, he argues, using the medical theories of the day, namely anti-contagionism, that hashish provides a really good cure, and he uses the word cure for the plague. At this time, anti-contagionists understood the plague as being produced by miasmas, or bad air, that were coming from poorly ventilated and unhygienic moist areas, was usually the way it was described. Also tied to this moral judgment of proper living, hygiene, cleanliness, that are also very influential and effective as tools of empire. So what he argues, taking the idea from Sassi, is that cannabis causes violence and insanity in the head, which is verified by all these ideas about the Muslim world, and therefore, as an anti-contagionist and also somebody who believes in homeopathy or simile-based therapies, which is a huge thing at this time, he believes that cannabis is going to be an excellent cure for the plague, and he publishes so in 1840. We'll get through very quickly. And here's a line again showing you these connections. I had learned from Monsieur de Sacy and other authors that there existed in the Orient a plant resembling hemp, the effects of which were intoxicating. And I heard of the quite general use of this drug among Arabs. Monsieur de Sacy gave it the name hashish. I therefore sought it out profoundly, convinced that if this plant had intoxicating properties, it must have some medical power over the nervous system. So again, these direct connections through the colonial experience, misinformation about what actually happened, and then tied to these new ideas about what cannabis can do medically. It was also believed, in using a very similar logic, understanding insanity as a problem of the central nervous system. Moreau de Tours, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, also jumped on the bandwagon using Dawamesk to treat insanity, thinking that it could psychotomimetically, which is the term, a very clunky term, could mimic the symptoms and thus cause the actual disease itself to subside, which of course was not the case. And then really the heart of it, and this is where I'm going to stop, and this is the heart of chapter 4, because of the problems with Dawamesk, it wasn't able to be standardized. It was coming in from different sources, from different raw materials. It meant that it had drastically different levels of potency. So in the 1830s, several people in the British Empire, the brothers Smith, O'Shaughnessy, started experimenting using different methods of distilling a tincture. O'Shaughnessy merely poured it in and soaked it in alcohol. The brothers Smith used an acid bath to engender isomerization. But eventually in the late 1830s and 1840s, the French really take over this industry, and they become incredibly competitive and incredibly skilled, I would argue, at figuring out new, innovative ways to distill cannabis tinctures. And ultimately, through the 1840s, you have numerous competitions between cannabis tincture producers, and this is largely the story that was untold and where my book comes in. And you have numerous cases, legal cases between Gastineau and de Courtive, in which they're arguing in court over the right to priority to this particular cannabis tincture. Because of these fights, which take place in 1847 and 48, cannabis is on the minds of many epidemiologists, and ultimately in 1848 and 9, numerous epidemiologists and doctors throughout France use cannabis to treat cholera. They give it to 5,000-6,000 patients. It does not work, is really the story of the end of chapter 4. And because of this, it starts the end of cannabis tincture as a reputable medicine inside French discourse. My 5th and 6th chapters really focus on how the new ventures in North Africa, particularly in Algeria, also led to the decline of cannabis tincture. But I am running out of time, and I do want to hear your questions. So thank you very much, and I apologize for speeding up there towards the end.
Thanks so much, David, for that whirlwind tour of what is a very exciting and important book that I hope you all are ordering now. So a reminder to please put your questions in the chat room, and also I'll let you know that we have an extra 10 minutes if you want to stick around. If you're able to stick around, we'll keep David for 10 or 12 minutes to ask questions. So I see there is a question already from Tembisa. She says that in 1947, a pantoufle of Egyptian hashish was said to be confiscated from an American sailor in New York City. Any comment on the etymology of this apparently common referral to a common unit or method of smuggling discussed by by American customs officers in the middle of the 20th century?
Pantoufle. I have not seen that term. I'm writing it down now. No, I have not seen that term. But the one thing I will say, and this is coming mostly from my current research, because I'm planning quite quickly to get a sequel out to this. Sequel, that's not the right word. I want to finish the story, 1870 to 1970. But there is a significant amount of cannabis smuggling going on in the 1930s and 1940s in New York, with New York as a center. And it seems as international as what will come after, known as the French Connection, the heroin ring coming out of places like Marseille, and also the Mediterranean in general. So I am becoming more and more aware of these kinds of international smuggling rings. I even found one that I've not seen in any literature about somebody who set up a giant cannabis farm. It was a Mexican and a Mexican man, and then another international, I think from Europe. I have to double check, who set up a giant farm in Long Island that was eventually busted and was used in the years leading up to 37 to argue the Marijuana Tax Act. So I'm aware that there's a whole history of smuggling pre-37 that needs to be talked about, especially regarding international connections. But no, I've not heard of Pantoufle. I will definitely throw that in some search engines and see what I come up with, though. Thank you.
Thank you, David. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. Oh, Lucas has got a question. Otherwise, I have a question as well. He says, maybe a predictable question, but how did French pharmacy incorporate into common practice?
Yeah, that's a very, very pharmaceutical question, which I should have expected. I can only really speak, I think, for the 1840s and 1850s. I'm not an expert in terms of modern day French pharmaceutical practice, or I know much more about, let's say, differences between psychological practice and sort of knowledge of psychiatrics between France and the United States. But pharmacy is more, and like I said, I sort of stumbled. I realized there was a story here yet to be told. But what I can tell about 1840s and 1850s pharmacy, and especially my reading of Italian pharmacy journals and German pharmacy journals in the United States and Britain at the same time, France was a big deal. The French were a big deal, and especially, let's say, Moreau, the Dr. Moreau, the famous Dr. X that Gautier talks about with the Club de Hashish. When he writes his treatise in 1845 about hashish and mental illness, it is reviewed, I'm telling you, within a month. It's published in May, I believe. In June, July, August, there are reviews across Europe. And I'm telling, they're calling it the next best. Obviously, 20 years later, the sensationalism has dropped. It hasn't proved as effective. But just based on my knowledge of what's going on with cannabis, what's going on with tincture recipes, which another thing I found is the Brits will, Brother Smith particularly, and people there that are working on those recipes are going to ditch the British recipe for the French recipe. And the reason for that is the French used a 3 distillation method with alcohol, and the British used an acid bath, which tend to leave the product not really tasting well, and so on. So yeah, I think with those data points, the best I could say is that regarding cannabis, France was a trendsetter in the 1840s and 1850s. So it was determining, I think, how it was used. If you look at even publications in Utica and other major centers of psychiatric medicine, they're applying the Moreau method, right? It's and I write about this in the excellent Global History of Cannabis book that's coming out that Luke's an editor of next year. So, good question.
Thank you. You mentioned that there were the early trade was largely medical, and it was just one sentence in your presentation. But I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that. Was this done illegally? How much of this trade was driven by personal interest, or how much self-experimentation, or we might call it recreational use? But are doctors involved in a culture of cannabis consumption that also deserves its own story, perhaps?
Absolutely. I think that we can't make the strong distinction if we're looking in the 1830s and 1840s between drug and medicine related to cannabis. They're in the process of, I think, developing these two categories, this dichotomy. But when you look at recreational use, for instance, really outside of, and I'm increasingly turning my attention towards port cities like Marseille, which in the era of COVID is going to be increasingly difficult. But I have a feeling that recreational use in port cities like Marseille is going to be very different. But recreational use in the 1830s and 1840s in places like Paris, records that exist, we're talking about high-level elite literati, people who are doctors for the most part running these experiments. One of the coolest things I found, because everybody knows about the Club de Hashish, which met on in the islands, Ile Saint Louis, in the middle of the Seine in Paris, at the Hotel Luzon. I'm sure that phrase is written into all drug historians' brains to a certain extent. But what I found was over a dozen other doctors doing the same kind of thing during the same time. So these self experiences, as they're called, were an incredibly important part of not just recreational use and also determining the limits of recreational use. So you get these newspaper articles about such and such doctor and artist and musician took cannabis, took hashish, and they ended up in the streets being crazy. And what I see there is experimentation, a doctor trying to make sense of what's going on, feeling like a doctor, being this objective observer, but also feeling sort of egotistically entitled to experience it himself and not be overcome by the irrationality. Like the word taming I use here is really important for the title. These doctors quite literally thought they were taming this drug through their experimentation, whether with patients or with themselves. So I would argue, I can't put a percentage on it, but a significant percentage of recreational use is that I have sources on is coming almost entirely from the medical profession. So there's an incredibly blurred line. And then by the 1860s and 1870s, this is where I think you start to veer in the direction of recreational use. And then the interesting sort of narrative of Grimaud's cannabis indica cigarettes are going to complicate that narrative a little bit as well. And that's kind of what I'm working on now.
It's wonderfully rich material. There's another question in the chat box from Clark Ridgway. Did you find any evidence of French pharmacists, for example, Pelletier or Cavento, attempting to isolate any active chemical ingredients from hashish?
Yes, this was the $64,000 question for particularly societies of pharmacy in the 1850s. Their thought was, if we isolate this, we'll be able to better use it, and that's always an important part of, I think, early pharmacy in the 1800s. But yes, in 1853, the Society of Pharmacy put out a international call for a competition for all chemists and all scientists, anyone really, whoever could isolate the active agent inside cannabis would receive 1,000 franc prize. They even upped that prize, I believe, in 1855 to 1,500 because they weren't getting any submissions. They did get submissions. I was able to get my hands on some of them, not all of them. I at least saw the winning one. Pelletier, I believe, was involved. Cavento isn't striking any bells, but there were, I think, 3 or 4 French submissions, and then I'd say double that in terms of international submissions. And in the end, they gave, the name is escaping me, they gave somebody the prize, but he did not accomplish the task. And after that, there wasn't much discussion until the 1890s that I saw, or that I found thus far. And it's mostly in British context, the British Empire and British medicine. So there was a huge effort, a big effort, even a scientifically sponsored effort in the mid 1850s to find the active agent. But as we know, this will take until well into the 20th century to truly happen.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for David? I'm sure there are more as people will read your book and send you questions.
Well, I hope
then I want to give you a big welcome, a big thanks for all of the work that you've been doing and for this wonderful presentation that I'm sure has inspired and scintillated us. Oh, there's one more question. A comment on self-experimentation. The attitude was also cultivated by the literati. See Jeannie Moser's book. And thanks for the brilliant talk. And I will echo that comment. Thank you for this brilliant talk and all the work that you're doing in this area. I think it's challenging us to think about some of the mythologies around hashish and cannabis more broadly. And thank you very much. And for everyone who's listening, please join us for the last session. And thank you all for your participation. Thanks, David.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I enjoyed it. Thank you.